become like what was effectual and what did it do was more how sport was constructed in the 16th century, and how sport was, the more I kind of looked at it, it became this totally different idea than we have of sport today. So more or less, this is just kind of putting things into context with regard especially to what's effectual, but more about like what context. I'm just sort of repeating what Charles said, but how people would have constructed this kind of thing, what they would have thought of effectual, what they would have thought of somebody who won effectual, how prizes were given out, and how that kind of overlaps a lot with the entire idea of what is a sword and why do we carry them, and why, 100 years after their useful battlefield weapons are long swords still considered something that are really, really important, right? So just before we kind of get started, if you all want to just kind of look at this sort of image for a second, I'm going to play around with this like annotation tool, right? So we even have right in here, this big sort of box. One thing you might not have noticed when you looked at it is that this is actually raised. Like the ground is here, right? And these guys are up on this sort of raised platform, which I thought was really interesting. I don't really have anything really to add to that. Just sort of, it's an odd sort of little barrier that they have in there, right? But also pay attention to the weapons, right? There's a guy here with a halberd. It looks like this guy over here, they have rapiers and daggers. It looks like there's a pair over here with long swords, which is what we sort of recognize. And then all around the area, there are other people doing other sort of weird stuff. And those of you who are into sort of sartorial history might even notice that this is something that these people are dressed in like mid-16th century or mid-17th century clothing rather than sort of late 16th century. So we tend to think of the effectual as something that happened around, Meyer's time, 1550s, 1560s, up to the early 1600s, but they continued for quite a long time after that. And they included, pretty much all of them included longsword, dusack, staff, various staff weapons, and they very often started including rapiers even by the 1580s. So this is something that we tend to look at Meyer as being, the effectual is, or the longsword is the effectual weapon. It's not really true. Most of the weapons that Meyer teaches, in fact, would have been used at effectual right there in the barriers, or in when people are kind of playing around outside the barriers as well. You can see some of that going on in this image here. But in any case, the whole presentation I call Secrets on Display. And the reason I call it that for the most part is because the point essentially I'm trying to get at, right, is that the effectual didn't necessarily change fencing. Effectual is just a way to display fencing. And what really changed wasn't necessarily the fencing, but the culture that surrounded it, right? So what we're actually going to be talking about is not only the effectual and sort of its sportive aspects, but also just the culture of masculine violence in the 16th century in the Holy Roman Empire, and especially in free cities. So it's going to be a fairly wide-ranging things, but I'm going to try to follow more or less this presentation format as we go. If any of you have any questions, I do have the participants list up on my screen. So if you just want to use the raise hand function, if you come across anything that you'd like to know, I'll be more than happy to answer questions. I like this to be more of a discussion than just a long, boring lecture.
You're a Zoom pro.
Yeah. I'm also my only current day job right now is actually a graduate, or not a graduate, sorry, a community college professor. So I'm pretty used to this stuff. Anyway, okay. To set some context, right? So in the early 16th century, a lot of things are changing. This is when, the last sort of week of what we consider kind of like the main Liechtenauer corpus is about 20 years old by this point, right? We're not really producing any books that we considered really the sort of right in the middle of the dot graph in terms of the Liechtenauer tradition, right? Things are changing. And we tend to view them as the way that the treatises changed. And different writers were kind of taking different approaches to the Titel, and they're describing them in these very different ways. And, we end up getting very weird things happening to them. And a lot of this is just happening because, culture is changing pretty rapidly. And even before the Reformation, If we look back to like the 1450s or 60s, or the Gutenberg press was coming out, and religious writings were becoming much more widespread, much more frequent, and the access to print technology and literacy was raising, and all this stuff is already happening. And then, in the 1520s, we have the Reformation, which we can mostly blame on this guy, which is Martin Luther. Right? We don't really need to get into Luther's whole deal necessarily, but for the most part, he was one of many people who were upset at the Catholic Church, and sort of harnessing the new print technology and whatnot, he sort of made this massive social change start happening. And obviously this went on for a really long time, and most historians are sort of now looking at the Reformation not necessarily as just a single change that took place over time, but many smaller changes that all sort of coalesced around the same time. So Martin Luther sort of trying to be taken out of the center of the whole thing. And the printing press obviously has a lot to do with fencing, right? Because at least the fencing traditions that we follow are all written. So having access to something like a printing press means that people who may not have had the money or the clout to hire an artist and hire scribes to copy, or to make their new annotated gloss of the Liechtenauer tradition, suddenly have access to something that means that they can produce a fencing book on their own. And all at the same time, these social changes are impacting pretty much every level of society, right? So in 1523, we have what we call the German Knights Revolt. And to make a long story short, this guy's name is Franz von Sickingen, was one of the nominal leaders. And he was more or less upset that in the 1490s, the Holy Roman Empire decided to make feuding between noblemen illegal, right? They could no longer personally settle their scores without sort of reaching out to somebody above them, like the emperor, or like somebody the emperor appointed to be a go-between when they were feuding. Because what a feud was, if any of you read the book, I don't know, you can listen to the podcast that Charles did a few months ago that I was also part of. We read the book, The Feud in Early Modern Germany. Right, these were mostly ways to settle beef between two knights. Right, is if they, somebody takes a wagon that you owned and they went and sold it off, then you could basically sue the guy by going and capturing a wagon that he owned. And eventually you might settle your scores somehow, right? And the idea was that this was sort of private conflict that you dealt with privately. And this is a context for fencing, this is something where knights and people, they may not have had any land or money, but they certainly had a suit of armor and they definitely had a horse, might use as an excuse to go around settling their scores. So this was made illegal in about the 1490s. I don't know exactly which imperial diet made it illegal. I think it was like 1491. But they kept on doing it for like 100 years after that. It was just now that they could be legally punished for it. If you're actually interested in sort of this aspect of feuding and everything, I highly recommend the autobiography of the knight Gotz von Berlichingen, or Gotz of the Iron Hand. He actually wrote an autobiography in the 16th century, and the entire book is basically just him fighting feuds. There's one sort of bad translation of it available in English that I got on like cheap books or something like that. But if you want to look into that, it's honestly really fascinating. So anyway, the German Knights Revolt ends up getting brutally crushed. The Holy Roman Empire hires mercenaries. They come in and sweep through and destroy the thing, but they're also still fighting the Italian wars down in the south, so they head right down back to northern Italy right after that. And only about a year after the German Knights Revolt ends, we have the German Peasants' War. And the German Peasants' War was actually the largest sort of popular rebellion in European history prior to the French Revolution. This thing was huge. It swept across mostly southern Germany and up into central Germany. And at first, it looked like just another peasant rebellion, which happened all the time. But it soon took on this sort of apocalyptic level of like, there are peasants everywhere, and they're all in revolt, and they're all in league with one another, and there are even knights fighting with them, and it's really, really bad. The Holy Roman Empire doesn't have enough troops. They have to haul them back from Italy, so this goes on for like an entire summer. But like most peasant revolts, it gets brutally crushed basically that winter, and the German Peasants' War is over. But I bring up these two conflicts mostly to point out that these are representative of two very distinct classes, right? We've got the German Knights Revolt, and we've got the German Peasants' War. And in between those two classes, we have guys that call themselves burghers, just citizens, people who live in, for the most part, free cities of the Holy Roman Empire, who are kind of looking above them socially. They're looking at these knights who make their careers basically being bandits to one another. Gotz von Berlichingen, by the way, has fought or has a long-standing, I think it's like a 25-year-long feud declared against the city of Nuremberg that he just goes on over and over and over again, just constantly like raiding caravans. And in fact, a Nuremberger firing a cannon at him that takes off his arm, and that's where he gets the iron hand and everything. To just put into context this, you know, like if you're just a tradesman living in Nuremberg, like there's a knight just sort of riding around in the woods outside of Nuremberg waiting for trade caravans to come out so that he can capture them and ransom them back to the city, right? So like you're looking at these knights and you're saying, these guys are insane. They're totally off their rockers. And then, you know, the next summer, after they wrap up the whole knights thing, you've got the German Peasants' War, which threatens literally everything about your entire world, right? This wasn't just like a peasant revolt that was like, hey, give us hunting rights back to the woods, please. This is about like toppling the entire social order. There's a ton of these people who are essentially, you know, proto-communists. In fact, one of the guys who writes the early history of the German Peasants' War is actually like one of the sort of defining Marxists. So anyway, right? This is a big, huge, sweeping, massive thing that threatens everything about your existence. And so it would stand to reason that a burgher kind of looking at in the middle of this thinks that they're probably the only sane people on earth, right? And this is kind of eroding this idea of the three estates, right? So you as a burgher are work, right? You're probably a craftsman, some sort of artisan. There's obviously a social hierarchy within even the burgher classes themselves too, but the old three estates model basically says that there are three basically types of people, right, or types of men. There are those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. And burghers kind of throw a wrench into this whole thing because they do all of those. They're all of them, right? They're also like inventors, right? They're the guys that have invented the printing press, and they're the people that are publishing these religious pamphlets, and they're the ones sort of funding the building of churches. They also have to fight. They have to serve in the militia. They're also the people that are hired as mercenaries. So they're really kind of the tip of this sort of rusting social model that's coming down. And they're very aware of it. If you read a lot of the stuff that burghers just wrote, even just letters to themselves about their business and whatnot, it's chock full of this awareness that they're kind of an odd social class that doesn't exactly have a lot of things that they can really claim as theirs, that doesn't also step on somebody else's toes. So essentially their response to this is to arm themselves and to prove that, yeah, they work, but they can also fight, and they can fight really well, right? And this leads to this sort of burgeoning honor culture where they have to fight duels to prove that they can fight, and they have to carry swords to show that they can duel and to show that they can fight, right? And obviously this lends, because it's humans, right? And all human activity essentially ends up turning into a game. They end up kind of essentially creating the fectual, or at least making something that had existed before, you know, like a sort of a playful public display of fencing, into something that is actually more important for them and their expression of themselves. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, right? So the rise of the burgher class is going on, right? So I want to talk a little bit, but briefly, I'm going to skip past Andre Paurnfeindt a little bit, but Andre Paurnfeindt might be one of these guys, right? This is the coat of arms of his boss, who actually wrote his Fechtbucher for in the early 16th century, right? He was a bodyguard, a Trabant. He's also the first time that we have a written record for of somebody who wrote a Fechtbuch who referred to himself as a Freifechter, right? So he wrote his book, Ergründung ritterlicher Kunst der Fechterei, in 1516. So this is, again, just a few years before sort of the Reformation itself kicks off, right? It's one of the first fully printed Fechtbucher that also has illustrations. These are woodcut block illustrations that were put in there. And one of the most unusual things he does is that he obviously has access to, I think probably Ringek, or a copy of Ringek, But he has access to the Legionnaire corpus in some way, and he clearly quotes directly from the Title, but what he does is he takes the Title and he breaks it apart and he puts them into these 12 rules, right? And that's the first part of his book, the first chapter of his book. He calls it 12 Rules for Beginning Fencers. And they're really basic stuff like how to stand, right? You want to stand with your back foot straight back and your front foot bowed. And you want to, you know, fight with strength and lean out with length. And it's stuff that you remember, right? If any of you who are familiar with the Title read through the 12 rules, you'll easily see exactly what bits of the Title they were taken from, right? And this kind of gets around to the fact that this is, again, the fencing hasn't changed, but the audience did, right? There's a bigger need for beginners to be educated in how to fence well, right? And so Paurnfeindt is just the only one that we have a printed record for, right? And there are probably dozens of these people doing other things. But it's getting to the fact that people fence. They always have fenced. They're probably not very good at it, but they're doing it anyway, right? And so Paurnfeindt, sort of at the behest of his boss, writes this book and is trying to sort of lay out some rules. And he says, like, hey, look, you know, young people need to learn how to fence from people who've done it for a long time. Otherwise, they're just going to make fools of themselves, right? But the really important thing, at least in terms of this presentation, and I could talk about Paurnfeindt for like a lot longer, but I won't, is that he calls himself a Freifechter, right? And we're not exactly sure what that means in 1516. But in order to talk about that, first we should talk about the Brotherhood of St. Mark. The Brotherhood of St. Mark, or the Marksbrüder, as we probably mostly know them, were obviously dedicated to St. Mark, and there's his sigil right there, which is a winged lion with a sword. And according to Roger Norling, if you look at the Meyer plates, sometimes you'll see cats. Sometimes you'll see cats doing very rude things, like licking their buttholes. And according to Roger Norling, that's actually sort of a direct thumb in the eye to the Marksbrüder Guild. Anyway, they received what was called their imperial privilege in 1487. An imperial privilege, basically, a privilege in the sense of the late 15th century, was basically that a king or a monarch, in this case the Holy Roman Emperor, basically wrote down and gave like a written document to a person or an organization or even a city, a whole city. A free city is just something that has received an imperial privilege, right? And that essentially just sort of dictates certain rights that you have and certain responsibilities that come along with those rights, right? So they got their privilege in 1487 that marked them as the first and the only, at the time, fencing guild. So they had a privilege just like the Cutler's Guild had, just like the Butcher's Guild had, or any other sort of guild. They had certain rights and responsibilities. And one of those rights was they were legally the only people who could bestow the rank of master on any fencers, right? This is the emperor that gave them the papal privilege. I believe it was Regent III or the second. I forget. I'm supposed to have notes on this that pop up, but they have not popped up. It's all right. It's been a while since I've given this. In any case, in 1487, he decides these are the guys. They're the ones that are going to be able to teach the new generation of fencers that we need, because we need people to fight wars, right? And 1487 is sort of right when the Italian wars are sort of hotting up, and there's a lot of things that need to go on. The Holy Roman Empire needs soldiers, people that know how to fight, right? And for whatever reason, it's the Furriers Guild that are the sort of centerpiece of this group of fencers that the emperor decided to honor with this privilege. So they're associated with the Furriers for a long time, even to the point where there are references to just furriers saying, you know, furriers are not allowed at this particular fectual, for instance, that happened once. Or people will write kind of rude things on the side of their shop at a building that says something like, you know, Freifechters are friends and furriers are enemies and things like that. Right? And for whatever reason, you might be a member of the Marksbrüder and you're not a furrier, but people might call you a furrier anyway. Furriers were also one of the wealthier trades. They weren't just people who made like think of it as almost like people that make fur coats, right? The way that we kind of think of fur today is something that's actually really fancy and really resplendent. They weren't just people who made like hats or whatever. That was something that was a little lower tier in the burgher hierarchy. But again, they had this official responsibility to make masters of the longsword. And that meant that they had this kind of monopoly on testing. They had a monopoly on bestowing the rank. And that rank sometimes meant you might get paid more if you're a mercenary, because if you can show them a document that says, I'm a master fencer, well, then they might pay you more. You could also get paid more in a mercenary company by being a really great cook. So I wouldn't really think that this was like a super duper important deal. But it was something that the Furriers Guild and the Brotherhood of St. Mark really had a lockdown on. Which brings us back to the Freifechters, right? So if we're looking at the sort of internal structure of the Marksbrüder, one of their ranks as a journeyman, because this is a guild just like any other, they actually call it a Freifechter, which just means free fencer, or sort of an open fencer, something like that, right? But I think, and I think there's enough reference that can prove it, that the Freifechter were a different group of people. And they were not necessarily just a different group of, like a competing guild. I think they were a much more sort of anarchist kind of a thing, right? So I like this picture mostly because it just shows the fancy duds that people would wear. And you also see these sort of flails that people are carrying here. And like this is a farming implement, right? And we might not think of that with some people who are dressed, you know, with probably enough clothes that you could feed a peasant family for like a year on the cost of their clothes. But these are often part of parades and whatnot. And again, Roger Norling can probably talk a whole lot more about this kind of thing than I can necessarily. But this is actually a woodcut that is titled March of the Freifechter. Right? They were part of parades sometimes and whatnot. But the point of all this, right, is to sort of get to speaking about their place in respect to the Marksbrüder. And for the most part, people call themselves a Freifechter when they're trying to say that they're not affiliated with it. So if you're a Freifechter within the Marksbrüder, you're probably going to say, I'm a member of the Marksbrüder, rather than something like, I'm a Freifechter, right? Because a Freifechter has a different connotation, right? But I'm leaning much more heavily toward they're unaffiliated and they're kind of dicks about it, right? So they know of the Marksbrüder. They know that the Marksbrüder technically have the legal privilege to grant masters of the longsword, and they're going out of their way to say that we don't need to be called a master by these guys. We're good fencers anyway, right? And this actually has some other kind of social parallels. So when the printing industry was actually getting going, early there were obviously people who were trying to make it a guild, right? Like, we are the Printers Guild. In order to be a printer, you have to buy your stuff from us. You have to work with the people that we want you to work with. You have to, you know, obey the rules that we have and pay guild dues and all of that other stuff. And there were a ton of people in the early 16th century, especially in places like Basel, which was Meyer's birthplace, who were resistant to this idea. They wanted to leave printing what they called zunftfrei, or guild-free. And the reason for this was because putting it in a guild puts it through this sort of hierarchical control system that they didn't want it to be a part of. Because they thought things like printing and the access to the written word was far more important than just letting one or two guys profit from it, right? And so if you kind of think about that, think about this attitude of having things zunftfrei, having art especially, and then you kind of read something like Meyer's introduction to his whole book, it's chock full of these sort of trigger phrases that are talking about the art is something that is noble and it's meant for everybody. It's something that you know, people should practice, whether you are, you know, a guy with a horse and a suit of armor, or you're just a dude who lives in the street, right? And if we kind of break that down and look at a lot of our sources that we have, especially from the early or the mid 16th century, it's full of this stuff, right? And it always calls fencing the art, right? It's never just fencing. It's always praiseworthy. It's always something that you're doing to be praised and to praise the art and do honor to the art itself, right? And so my conjecture, and it's not something that I've proven yet by any means, is that the Freifechter were actually a sort of disparate, non-hierarchical organization, not even necessarily an organization, but a group of people who thought of fencing as something that should be kept zum frei, right? And they marked themselves out by that, by calling themselves Freifechter, right? One other thing I wanted to point out about this image here is you see a few of them wearing laurel crowns, which we're going to get to in a little bit when we're talking about the Fechtbucher and especially how to win a Fechtbucher. But I want you all to sort of think about that as we keep going on, right? Does anybody have any questions at this point?
I've got a question.
Sure.
How can we think of this, how closely can we think of this as being related to, not related to, but how can we compare this to the modern open source movement?
I think it's a good question. I think the parallels are pretty clear there, right? Like the open source movement is the idea that you take something like Photoshop, right? That has proven to be much more useful than probably the very narrow and sort of marketing kind of thing that they wanted to have it in the first place. And you have something like GIMP, which we all have opinions about GIMP probably, but right. But yeah, I think it's very similar. The idea that this stuff should be open access, that people should have access to it. They're gonna get it anyway, right? I think that's a big part of the open source thing, is that a bunch of people pirated Photoshop and then they sort of ripped it down to its constituent parts and then created their own photo manipulation programs, right? But yeah, I think it's pretty close. I think it's a good parallel, to be honest. Or even something like you know, all these streaming services that are being put behind paywalls. Like every single channel now has their own streaming service, and 5 years ago it used to just be Netflix. You can see you look at the graph of, right, how many people are pirating and how many different services there are, and that graph is like a parallel line that just goes straight up, right? But yeah, more or less wasted a lot of words to say, yes, I think that's a great parallel. Any other questions before we go on? Okay, cool.
We had a few, actually, sorry.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So earlier in the chat, we had Marxbruder as the prime example, but some Fechtbucher were in vogue because of who was in power and the religious preference. How did this affect the burghers?
That's actually a really good question, right? Because it, more or less, right, anyone could throw a Fechtbucher, pretty much. All you'd have to do is you would have to basically go up to whatever city you were in and you wanted to throw the Fechtbucher in, and you have to go up to the city authorities and you would have to request permission to throw a Fechtbucher. They would say either yes or no, but if they said yes, you might have to do something like prove yourself as quote unquote a master. We actually have records of Meyer doing this in Strasbourg, or at least requesting to throw a Fechtbucher, and I don't think we have the answer that he got back, but he at least petitioned the city council to do it several times. But this is something that is, it's private, but it's also civic, and it's also like lavishly public, but also could be totally private, right? So like there's a record of a wealthy burgher from Augsburg throwing a Fechtbucher for his like 7-year-old son. And it's just like him and his school kid buddies, and they found a fencing master, he's unnamed, and he threw a Fechtbucher for him, right? But if you're going to get into the ones that are like really huge, then you're going to have to deal with like the city hierarchy. And in order to do that, you're going to have to basically do whatever the city hierarchy wants you to do. So if you're in a free city that has said, okay, we're not actually going to make any religious stipulations at all, then whatever. But if you're in a very Protestant city, or if you're trying to throw a Fechtbucher for like a Calvinist lord or something like that, then you're probably gonna have to jump through a few more hoops and maybe be a little bit more exclusionary about who you let in, who you don't let in. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And then we have, just a clarification, Freifechter was considered a wandering master or more of a freelancer?
They are like a journeyman, right? So technically, if we look at like a normal guild structure, the idea is you go from apprentice to journeyman to master. And so the journeyman is, you are sort of The idea initially, I think, was that you would sort of wander and learn from a bunch of different masters, but usually it just means that you go and work with a specific master for a certain amount of time. The guild determines exactly how long you have to do that, but it basically means like you are able enough to do the job that you've been training for on your own, under the supervision of a master, but you can make your own money. So a wandering master is kind of a good way to put it. They weren't technically like a master in terms of having the rank, but people might actually call them a master, right? If you're running effectual, then you're a master, even if you don't have a piece of paper from the Marksbrüder that says you are a fencing master, right? Does that make sense?
And then we have one more. How about German cities outside the HRE, like Königsberg?
Probably function fairly the same, right? Because technically something like Strasbourg or Augsburg or Nuremberg were free cities, which meant that they were part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they also had a different relationship with them than, I can't even think of another city that somebody else might have, right? But this is a cultural thing, right? This isn't something that like, the Holy Roman Emperor didn't sit down and say, I'm going to start throwing effectual. And this is something that people are just doing, right? So I've only done a lot of research about like the free cities ones, and it's the only ones that I know that we have a lot of records for. But I know that there are a ton that happened in like Poland, and places in Poland that are outside of the Holy Roman Empire. And they were definitely still a thing. They were definitely still very popular, and were ongoing outside there. I don't know that they would have had too many different kind of elements of social construction that go in there, and there might be different things about like hierarchical structures and city government and whatnot that might be going on in a place like Königsberg rather than Strasbourg, for instance. But I will say that I don't personally see it as something that was really tightly controlled, other than somebody asked to do it and the city authorities had to sort of sign off on it, right? Again, I'm not, if that answers your question.
Yes, thanks.
Cool. Anything else? All right. So there are some commonalities between the sort of Freifechter movement and the Marksbrüder. Both of them, we have Fechtbucher from people who self-declared as Marksbrüder, and we also have them from people who self-declared as Freifechter, right? So the Freifechter that we know of, Paurnfeindt, Solinger, and Meyer called themselves in sort of our period, and then a few people after Meyer, a lot of them who quoted Meyer and quoted extensively from his book, also called themselves Freifechter. If you guys have looked at the totally ridiculous Fechtbuch by Michael Hunt, H-U-N-D-T, which is the one with like the 100 tricks basically, and he always kind of like rambles on about, hey, my lord, if somebody comes to attack you, tell them that you're not going to fight the both of them at once and then stab the guy through the face, right? He actually calls himself a Freifechter, and I believe his book was written in 1611. So anyway, we have this extensive sort of trajectory of Freifechter people writing books. We also have Marksbrüder who wrote books, and their books have a lot of commonalities, right? Both of them evolved the Titel. Both of them basically took the Titel as a starting point, broke it apart in different ways, and reoriented it toward whoever their audience was at the time. Both groups primarily taught, at the very least, a longsword, a sword in one hand, and a staff weapon. So this is something that Paurnfeindt is kind of the first one to do it. He has the longsword, which is the first, and he also lists about 8 other types of longsword that he thought were worth mentioning. He also is the first master that we know of to use the word dusack or dusack, but he also uses messer pretty much interchangeably, and then he teaches the staff. And he talks about all these essentially as these are starting points to various other weapons that you can use for various things, right? And I chose this picture in particular because it, if you look at pretty much any woodcut of a soldier from the mid-16th century, and this one's from 1559, you will almost always see either a long sword, that's what this guy's got here, or a great big sword, a staff weapon of some kind, or like a dusack or a rapier hanging from the guy's side. And you see this almost all the time. They're always carrying at least two weapons. And sometimes it might be like a rapier with like a big old Schlagschwert over their shoulder, or in this case, like a big old longsword with a big old staff weapon or pike or something on the other side. But this is really, really common. You see this all the time. And it has pretty clear parallels to clearly the ideas that these people thought were useful weapons to learn and carry around, not only for military purposes, but for other purposes as well. But it's extremely common in art that shows soldiers to show them with multiple weapons. And usually it conforms again to this sort of three-weapon model that that Paurnfeindt sort of started, right? With the Freifechter especially, but this is increasingly true with the Marxbrüder that I've looked at as well, they don't actually have an armored or a mounted section, which is kind of interesting to think about, because if this is, if they're, you know, if you're a Marxbrüder and you're trying to teach people to use the sword in a military context, something like a halberd or a pike is going to be a lot more useful to them than trying to stick them up on a horse with armor and, you know, wrestling on the back of a horse. And for the Freifechter, right, it makes sense too, because if you're teaching burghers, if you're teaching a guy who's, you know, he's a shoemaker, he comes to the Fechtbucher every now and again, or he comes to pay for a few lessons and wants to learn some tricks with a longsword so he can look cool at the next Fechtbucher. They don't need to know armor or riding on a horse either, at least not for their fencing. It might be different in other ways. If I get sidetracked and start talking about firefighting, I apologize in advance. But again, like I said, these were useful for 16th century battlefields as well as civic context. So what is the civic context? So we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of expected avenues of violence for a burgher in the 16th century. So I guess before we move on, right? So to be clear, a burgher, burgher means citizen, basically. And to be a citizen, you had to have been sponsored essentially by a guild. So when Meyer left Basel and he moved to Strasbourg, he was part of the Cutlers Guild, and he was a journeyman. When he married Apollonia Ruhlmann, who was a widow of a guy named Jacob Wittgau, Jacob Wittgau was part of the Cutlers Guild, and then he died. He was a master cutler. Meyer actually married Apollonia Ruhlmann, and her sort of absorption of the privilege that Jacob had as a guild member and citizen transferred directly to Meyer, basically at the moment they got married. So this was essentially a way for the Cutlers Guild to say, hey, cool, you're with us, you're a citizen. Now you get to do the work, and you also have to do things like pull guard duty every now and again, right? Burghers they could legally be armed because they legally had to serve in the militia. And the militia was basically the city watch. So they had to do things like guard the gates and stand guard at towers and public powder magazines. They had to make night patrols. Probably if you were somebody in Strasbourg or something like that, it would depend on the size of your guild, to how often you'd actually have to pull guard duty, basically, but it might be as often as like once every 2 weeks. And this would be like basically a night patrol, right? You'd go until like the bells rang 10 p.m. until the bells rang 10 a.m. and you're up and walking around the street all the time. And we know that this was a thing that people didn't really like, because there's all sorts of stuff in civic records that are saying like, guards cannot stop at taverns. And there are even some rules about taverns, like taverns can't keep like a burning brazier outside the door because the guards will stand there warming their hands up when they should be walking around the street calling the time, stuff like that. It also meant that you would have to, basically anytime the bells of the city rang for any danger, you would have to be up and armed and armored and respond to it, right? So this means that you've got an entire city that are full of men who are armed, who have armor, and have the expectation to be trained to use that at the drop of a hat, right? So this obviously leads to things like duels, right? And so when we're thinking about a duel, normally what we think of is two guys with sharp swords and they're trying to kill each other. And for the most part, it's kind of true, but it's also kind of not. But what is super true, and what we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, is that duels are always extremely controlled. They have rules, people follow the rules at their peril, or they don't follow the rules at their peril, which might be more true, right? It may or may not involve killing the other guy, but generally killing the guy wasn't necessarily the goal, right? We'll talk about exactly what the goal is in a second. So we've got duels. That's clearly violent, and it's mostly in a HEMA context. That's kind of what we're thinking about. When we're talking about civic violence, we're talking about doing violence to other guys with a sword. We're going to think about duels for the most part. There's also brawls, right? And what's different between a duel and a brawl? Well, for one thing, in this image here, we don't see a lot of swords. We see a guy with a big old pot, right? We see people pulling their hair and kicking at knees and doing things that are clearly against the rules. We've got a crying child over on one side and a dog barking and women trying to pull men off of each other and whatnot, right? Brawl, to be quick about this, is chaos, and it's something that disrupts the civic order in a similar but not quite as threatening way as like a duel, right? And lastly, we have something like a fechtbucher, which is an organized way to demonstrate your sort of martial skill in a way that is controlled, but also demonstrates the same things that you're going to be demonstrating if you're fighting a duel. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. Right, so first let's talk a little bit more about duels. So here, once again, here's the big image. I like this one because it shows two guys. This is literally just a woodcut that says two men dueling. And I really like it because it actually shows them using longswords, which, and they're in like 1530s, maybe 1540 style clothing. And we don't often think about longswords in duels sort of that late into the 16th century. But anyway, it's a curiosity. I like it. There it is, right? So the thing that I really want to make clear about dueling is that it follows a very carefully controlled pattern of escalation. And if any of you have hung out around Charles for a while now, you've probably heard a lot about this, right? And Charles would be the perfect person to ask about sort of these sort of patterns of escalation that are going on. But essentially, what happens first is that there's some sort of insult. Somebody is offended, somebody demands the other person apologize. Maybe they don't, right? But something happened. Say you went up and you bought a round of drinks for the room and the guy didn't drink with you. Well, what an asshole, right? So you go up to him and you say, hey, how come you didn't drink with me? And he says, oh, I don't want to drink with you. And you say, why not? And he doesn't want to give you an answer, right? Hello? So you ask him to apologize.
Enter.
Right? So you ask him for an apology. And maybe that guy doesn't think that you deserve an apology. Maybe it's just a simple misunderstanding and you should back off, right? And then somebody gets called out. And usually what happens is the person who is insulted initially demands the apology. When the apology is not forthcoming, they call the person out. So this can get really confusing, and this became more or less a social art form by like the 19th century, of sort of like engineering situations where you would be the aggrieved party, even though you're definitely out looking for a fight. That kind of thing happened all the time in the 18th century, and that was a kind of a really big, much more complex ritual than what's going on here, right? So another thing we should keep in mind is that duels happened like right away. If you're getting into a duel in the 16th century, you're getting into it over a conflict that probably started within the hour that you pull your sword out. Which is also different from later period duels when they have like a specifically like socially organized cool down period where like, okay, you're insulted at everything. Maybe take a breather for a couple of days. You might feel different and don't want to go shoot a guy in 2 days rather than like right now, right? And this is mostly because these duels are becoming such a big problem that it doesn't even take like the authorities interfering to say, please stop dueling, because anytime you do that, it just makes it worse. It's people that are recognizing that like way too many people are getting killed for dumb reasons. So we have to like create some way for this to let cooler heads prevail, right? But in the 16th century, right, if we're bumming around Strasbourg and we're getting into a duel, it's because it's something that happened like today, like right now, right? And then obviously after all this kind of social dance goes on, they have a fight. Usually it means they go outside, they have whatever swords they're wearing. Fairness is something that was extremely heavily socially policed, right? So let's say that I'm walking around CKDF and I bump into Charles and we have an altercation, and I've only brought my rapier, and Charles has a great big longsword. Probably what would happen is either Charles borrows a rapier from one of his students, or I borrow a longsword from one of his students, or one of my friends, or something like that. Because this can't be something that's unfair. This can't be something that if Charles wins, we can basically blame on him having the bigger weapon, right? Or if I win, you can blame me on having the more foreign or inscrutable weapon or something like that, right? It's meant to be fair. They're socially constructed and they're policed by everyone watching to be fair. They're also done in front of an audience. This is you will not have a duel with somebody if you're the only two people in the room, even if you hate the guy. It's just not worth it. What makes it worth it is that people are watching. People are going to watch and they're going to judge you. And it's really bad if you behave in a dishonorable fashion. So this not only means, you have to respond to somebody who's threatening violence at you with violence, but it also means you have to do it in a manner that is honorable and fair, right? So when Meyer's talking about thrusting being abolished amongst the Germans, he's not just talking about you can't thrust at effectual. He means that thrusting is something that is viewed socially as dishonorable amongst burghers. You don't thrust your fellow countrymen. It's too dangerous, right? You just don't do it. And he's talking about duels as well as effectual, sportive play. So I think it's really important to get that point across, right? Because the duel isn't about killing the other guy. It almost never ends that way. What it's about is demonstrating your sort of masculine virtue to everybody watching, even if the stakes might be deadly, right? And the danger is obviously a big part of it, but it's not necessarily the point. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I want to get across when we're talking about duels, is that they're not necessarily always going to end in death. They're usually going to end, when quote unquote honor is satisfied. And that could mean somebody's clearly just too drunk and he keeps slipping on the cobbles, right, and busting his face open. Or it could mean that I run the guy through the body, or it could mean that we both get a couple of nicks and scrapes after a few passes, but we've both done it without flinching, and we're done now, right? It follows a pattern, right? And the pattern obviously has sort of outliers and sort of different things that happen, but for the most part, this is a very kind of clear pattern of it's settling a score that both people might believe is stupid at the time, but they have to go through the monkey dance anyway, right? Anybody have any questions about that?
We had a few,
Sure.
not necessarily centered just around the duels, but the whole, the conversation leading up to it.
Sure.
So initially we had, what about Katzbalgers? I hope I said that right. Or are they classified as messers in artwork?
That's an interesting question. And I think James Riley would probably be the guy to ask about Katzbalgers. But Katzbalgers, for those that don't know, have, and I think this might be where the question is leading, they have a rounded tip, right? It's not pointed the way that we think of a lot of swords, and especially like rapiers and dusacks and stuff like that have an obvious point. Whereas a lot of the sort of Katzbalger type swords have a flattened sort of rounded tip. As far as I know, those were still sharp, and as far as I know, those are still pretty okay at thrusting. But its relationship necessarily to kind of this social convention that thrusting is like a bad thing to do, I'm not sure. My instinct, having studied a lot of like later period sort of military equipment and whatnot, is that the rounded tip was probably something that's more economic than anything else, that maybe it's just a cheap way to bust out a sword that you don't really need to take a lot of time caring for, but I'm not really sure. If you could reach out with James Riley, I know he's been doing a lot of stuff about Katzbalger. I think he's got a really nice one from Arms and Armor too. So if you can get a hold of him, that might be good.
Okay. The next one we had was ringen looked down upon, or was it still considered a foundational portion of the art?
I think it's definitely still considered a foundational part of the art. So Meyer has a wrestling section, and all of the wrestling section that he has is pretty advanced tricks, right? Like I have very little background in wrestling, and like I've repeatedly tried to look at the wrestling and just sort of figure some stuff out, but there's like nothing basic in there at all. You have to be a pretty good wrestler to even be able to kind of structure how you have to put together some of the tricks in Meyer, which is not to say they're impossible. It's just stuff that's like, as a beginner, I just can't grok it, right? It's like, you know, reach over and grab his left arm and drag it across your body. And it's like, that sounds super easy and you can do it with a willing partner. But as soon as you get somebody who like knows how to wrestle, you just can't, right? It's also my conjecture that the reason that Meyer says that he doesn't approve of grappling with the dusack specifically, he says that only in the dusack section, is probably because the dusack is the weapon that's most oriented towards the youth, right? Like young fencers are going to be the ones that you're teaching dusack tricks to. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason he says that he doesn't approve of grappling with the weapon is probably because a couple of 16-year-olds come up to him and pay him a pocket full of money and say, teach me some cool sword tricks, right? And he's trying to teach them how to do like a cool thing like the stork speak or whatever, and they just immediately all start wrestling. And he's like, for the love of God, stop wrestling. I'm trying to teach you how to use a sword, right? And I'm sure we've all seen it. If you just give people a couple of the synthetic Purple Heart dusacks or whatever, if they have any grappling background at all, they're not sword fighting. They're just wrestling, and they just have a really long lever in one hand, right? So I think that given that if you look at Fabian von Auerswald, right, he was like hired as like the ring-in guy for an emperor, right? And I'm pretty sure that this was something that people had been wrestling their whole lives, and it's still definitely something that like would be sort of a foundation to your fencing as well. And I think it's something that probably Meyer had to. I think one of the reasons that his book is structured the way it is to get people to think of the sword as your primary sort of method of hitting the other person, rather than using it to cover and then running in and wrestling, because I think that probably would have been a lot more common in the 16th century. So I have seen nothing that would suggest that ring-in was looked down on. Like culturally, within effectual, it's looked down on mostly because the idea of the effectual is that you're demonstrating your swordsmanship, not necessarily your wrestling craft. But in a lot of the images, we also see pairs of people wrestling, like images that show effectual and everything too. So it's sort of, I think, unambiguously still a widespread cultural practice, just sort of not an effectual, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any sources saying that it was treated similarly to how we approach it, where we have ring-in as a separate discipline within the fectula?
I don't know of any that say that explicitly. Again, my conjecture would be that if you are in the 16th century anywhere in a German-speaking country and there are 5 minutes to burn and there's more than 2 people in the room, there's going to be people wrestling. Like that would kind of be my thought. It seems like something that is like completely, it's everywhere, right? But as far as like, I don't know if they had specific competitions within or attached to Fechtschulin. But then again, Fechtschulin sometimes were part of like shooting fests, and shooting fests also had foot races and horse races and wrestling and all sorts of stuff too. So
neat. So maybe, but no source is saying so.
Right.
Then we have, is citizenship required reserve? So citizenship required reserve duty in the local guard? Question mark.
Yes. Yep. Basically, the American National Guard is actually based on the militia. It was a way to sort of formalize some of the training aspects of the militia, and that has eroded somewhat in the past 50 years or so. But yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it, right? Is that your responsibility is to your city and the city's environs, and that's it. And militias are, if you're a member of the militia, you're not necessarily a soldier, and this gets really complicated. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, you are considered more or less a reserve duty soldier, specifically for the city. And if you want to get even more specific, for your guild, which has responsibility to the city than anything else. So it's a very sort of, if you think of it as you're simultaneously serving in your local National Guard, your local volunteer firefighting organization, your local police forces, and every now and again doing like highway garbage pickup duty, like regularly. That's kind of the urban militia in the 16th century. But yeah, I think it's a good way of putting it, is kind of thinking about it as a National Guard sort of a thing.
And then in regards to dueling themselves, when you were discussing the witnesses, we had Elizabeth ask, are seconds a later innovation?
Yes, in the 16th century, there doesn't seem to be much indication that you have like a second per person. At least I've never really seen any reference to that, but there's usually at least one person whose responsibility is to sort of make sure things are fair. And a lot of times it actually falls on the innkeeper. And so the innkeeper has a responsibility to make sure that if any violence happens in his bar or near his bar or in the street outside his bar, it's his job to make sure that like daggers don't come out or people aren't trying to murder each other. And Anne Plusty, who wrote the martial ethic of early modern Germany, also has another book, which is a lot more affordable, by the way, that you can probably find on Amazon right now, which is called Bacchus and Public Order, which is about drinking culture in the 16th century. And she actually talks a little bit about dueling with regards to taverns in this place too. But yeah, seconds come around basically when you have that kind of cool down period, and then you have to organize a specific place and time and weapon and everything to go and duel. And you don't really need that if you're going to duel the guy who's sitting right across from me at the table right now. Because when you're arranging all these other things, you have to do it without emotion, right? And the two principals, obviously, are very emotional. So they can't actually be the ones making these plans because they're definitely going to try to get an advantage on the other person. And the role of the second in the kind of the later formation of the duel is to make sure that is emotionless and perfectly fair, right? So yeah, that's a later innovation. I think as early as the early 17th century, but it's not happening in sort of HRE duels in the 16th century, as far as I've seen.
And then I had a quick question. You had mentioned that there is a period of time after the initial insult and demanding for an apology where you can qualify the exchange as a misunderstanding and back down. Wouldn't that be a question to that person's honor that they weren't willing to defend themselves like immediately?
Yeah, and that's why it gets really tricky, because you know there's this sense of my favorite story about a duel is that there's at an inn that's run by a guy named Caspar. There are two guys sitting at a table, both of whom are named Caspar, which is great when you're reading through like the sources to try to figure out which one's which, right? So like Caspar 1 calls the other guy a name. He calls him a dog's cunt, which in the 16th century was like the fighting words of the time. And so this first guy calls him this name and he kind of storms off. And there's this really great line in the the deposition, and he ran into the baking hut and called for his sword, right? So he like goes home to get his sword and he's coming back. But in the time that it took for Caspar, his last name is Rauner, to go home and get his sword and come back, Caspar Aufschlager, who was sitting at the table, the one who was insulted, is just like continuing to do his thing. He doesn't really care, right? But there are all these dudes in the bar who were kind of just like hanging around saying like, hey man, you know, if somebody called me a dog's cunt, I'd slap him upside the head, right? And so he's sitting there just listening to all these people basically tell him like, dude, you got to do something about this. That he sort of reluctantly gets up and he goes out and he duels this guy and he ends up killing him. And as soon as he does, he hoofs it for the gate. He's trying to flee the city and he gets caught by the guard. He gets his life saved essentially because a captain of the guard who knew him through the militia said that he was generally a very steady fellow, like he was a good guy. So the city officials didn't hang him. But it easily could have happened another way, right? If he was known as kind of a drunkard or somebody who liked to provoke people, then, you know, if he killed somebody in a duel, he's probably going to get strung up, or he's going to get at least a much harsher sentence than Aufschlager got, which was just exile from the city for a year, right? And even exile from the city for a year is a pretty big, fairly harsh sentence. So yeah, you're totally right. I mean, if somebody just is very quick to apologize, like, especially after it's sort of crossed that little event horizon that says like, this is something you need to respond to, then yeah, maybe people will go behind his back and say he's a coward, right? Maybe the next time he gets insulted, he has to do something. And this is just like honor culture, right? This is omnipresent everywhere all the time. You have to be like sitting on pins and needles, making sure that any slight to your honor is addressed somehow. That doesn't always lead to violence and it doesn't always lead to a duel, but if somebody calls you a name, then maybe you call them a name back, right? Maybe it's in good fun, but maybe it isn't. And you can never know right? And this is like, I kind of personally find it very tedious when people are like, let's bring back dueling, right? Because I've like read about this stuff and I know how terrible it would be for everyone all the time. Like, think about any interpersonal conflict that you have right now, and think about the possibility that you might actually have to like have a life-threatening fight with that person at the drop of a hat. It'd be bad. It'd be really bad. So it's like, it's a really good question to ask, right? Because it would be up to the person to decide that. And maybe they make the wrong decision, you know, according to everybody else. Maybe they don't. Who knows? It sucks.
Now the honor culture as well, so in the event you are deemed a coward for not rising to the occasion every time a duel is presented, or the pathway to a duel is presented to you, that impacts you socially, correct?
Yeah.
Like it affects your
Definitely.
ability to go get like the choice cuts of meat or bread or anything within your social circle.
Yeah, it could also threaten your job, right? Because you are simultaneously, as a citizen, a representative of your city, and also of your guild, and also of your family and your household, you know, whoever that might be. So like, you know, imagine again, you're out there drinking or, you know, having a good time with your friends or whatever, and somebody insults you or whatever, and you don't respond in the proper way, and the rumor mill gets going, and then your boss brings you in the next morning at work and has a sit down with you, right? Like this is sort of how omnipresent this is. So it could definitely impact you socially, but it could also impact you like economically, and even within something as personal as your job, for sure.
It's like hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, right. It's a very like, yeah, it's awful in my opinion. It's really a bad time. Interesting to read about. I would never want to be a part of it. Anything else?
I think we're good.
Okay. So up next, we'll get through this one pretty quickly. Brawls. So brawls are fun in that they're not really at all. They're terrible, right? So a brawl is like if you were a city leader in Strasbourg, right? Brawls are the last thing that you want to break out. Because a brawl, it might be something where it's just like a few drunk guys waving, you know, pictures at each other, but it might also spill into something that's like a lot more serious, like a riot, right? And a riot can lead to something even more serious, like a pogrom. Like, let's run over to the Jewish quarter or whatever and attack them, right? Because we're all drunk and angry. It could also lead to just like really big street fights. Maybe some men in the Butchers Guild are having a fight with some people from the Cutlers Guild, and then, you know, somebody down the street sees it, and suddenly all of the people from the Shoemakers Guild are running down the street and getting involved in the duel, right? It has this possibility of spilling out into huge sort of citywide acts of violence. It's also usually associated with peasants or men of low character otherwise. Meyer actually says mindless peasants brawl at least 3 or 4 times in his treatise, which I think is really, and he uses that specific term a few times, mindless peasants brawl, which is different, obviously, from the honorable Kunst des Fechtens, right? The art of fencing, which is very different, very honorable, very noble. Whereas a mindless peasants brawl is just people trying to hurt each other for stupid reasons. It involves, if you basically, I've got like 100 images of duels that I keep needing to kind of throw in here because I think they're kind of fun. But a big thing is improvised weaponry, right? So there's got this guy waving a pitcher, they're pulling hair, they're kicking at their knees and stuff like that. There's somebody with their arm raised with a pitcher in just about every single image of a brawl that I've ever seen. Often associated with drunkenness, right? So here's another one, right? It's a guy who's gonna brain this poor dude laying down on his back. And this is basically a world apart from a duel. This isn't a duel. This is a mindless act of aggression. This is a mindless act of violence. This is something that people only do when they're out of their head with drink, or just people of low character in the first place. It's not something that an honorable burgher would ever, be caught doing, even though they did it all the time, right? But it's riotous behavior, right? Whole groups rather than individuals. And this is often something that in a brawl, there's not necessarily these kind of very structured social rules, right? Because in a brawl, there's not too many people in the audience, right? If you're near a brawl, you're either a participant or a victim of the brawl, right? You're not somebody who's kind of witnessing to make sure everybody's behaving properly. You are a part of it or a victim of it. So this is basically as different as you can get from a duel, right? This is wildness. This is something that you want to clamp down. Brawls are basically the reason, or fights like this are the reason that there are duels and structured behaviors with violence in the first place, right? Because if every single altercation turns into a brawl, that's a really bad thing for your city, right? Because that threatens like the entire city. What happens if somebody spills a lamp jar and the tavern goes up? Well, that entire row house, that entire street, might be on fire in minutes. That might threaten to burn down the entire city. And this stuff happened before, right? This is a very real fear. So, so when we think about violence, right, we have to think about it in terms of like, there's the proper way to do it, which is channeling things through this structure, right, where everybody's kind of carefully watching each other and everybody's making sure they're behaving properly. The alternative to that is the total anarchy of this sort of riotous, brawling behavior where people are trying to murder each other and they're not fighting fair and they're trying to brain each other over the head with a pitcher of ale. And it's not this tightly structured thing. So you can see kind of in the contrast, right, why a city full of armed men might have it in their sort of best interest to have this very carefully controlled outlet of their violence rather than just letting everything become a brawl, right, because it's really bad. So any questions about brawls before we move on?
Not necessarily a question, but I have an observation about this picture that you're using at present. So it almost looks like he was challenged in his residence and then got jumped by a group of drunken ruffians.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I don't know. I think you're talking about the bigger one, right? Just that one? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It could be. I think that this image is just called like a peasant's brawl. Like, I think that's what it's called. So yeah, it could be. It could be that like this dude with the pitcher is this guy's friend, or it looks like, another guy, the dude on the right is being pulled back by his wife, and the dude on the left, like this dude is like trying to pull him back by like the waistband of his pants,
Like that even the dog is getting into it.
Yeah. And you'll see like the yapping dog is a common feature of a lot of these images of brawls too, which I also think is pretty funny. Just like the social kind of the code in the art, right, is when you have a yapping, barking dog, like something's gone very seriously wrong, right?
But it's considered like an insult to like to be associated with a dog or to be equated to an animal or have animal behavior. Right.
Like Anne Plusty actually points out in her description of that duel that I described a couple minutes ago, of that the term dog's cunt was especially insulting. Like that was like the lowest thing that you could call somebody. So yeah. And again, we kind of think of like the animals that are present in Meyer's book. Kind of gives a little new meaning sometimes when you're looking at like in the wrestling plates, right? There's two dogs going at it in the center of the picture. It's pretty fun. Okay, anything else? Okay. So lastly, we get to the Fechtbucher, which is what we're here to talk about, right? So this is one part of a much bigger image that actually shows a whole lot else going on. So you can actually see, you get the annotation thing back out here, right? So you can see over here, there's a guy riding with a lance. And if you saw the whole image, there's another guy over here that he's actually riding against, who's also got a lance, right? But you got this dude over here, right? He's got a staff, and he's fencing another guy with a staff. You've got a dog, again. Wonder what that dog's doing, right? There's another dog next to it. This guy with a dusack in front of the fencing master, these guys with the long swords. If you're familiar with, well, Charles, I think it was last year, right, when he did that kind of exercise thing, right? And what's one of the common ways they talk about folks exercising at the time was throwing stones. So you got these two guys over here throwing stones. Roger Norling actually does a warm-up in a lot of his things where this guy here you basically like kind of hold the stone up to your chin like you're kind of back in Zornhut, and then you twist forward and hurl the stone forward. Anyway, right, this is a big thing. A lot's going on. We're going to talk about these guys in a second too, because they're pretty fun. But this is an image that is showing effectual, right? And this is sort of kind of gives you the scope that these things could be. Now, they weren't always this big. Again, like I said, like Georg, I think his last name is Schultz. I'd have to look it up. Anyway, these Augsburg or Nuremberg patrician basically throws this fectual for his child, his like 7-year-old son. It's like 10 kids and a fencing master in his house. And this is clearly a much bigger thing. Like this is a massive public festival with probably dozens of participants, hundreds of witnesses. There are people, city patricians that are riding, tilts at each other. There are people fencing with dusacks. There's people fighting with pikes. There's a guy with a pike over here. So a lot is going on, right? And this kind of, I think, gives a really good scope for what effectual had the potential to be, because it wasn't always a really kind of small thing, but it wasn't always this massive, huge thing. But it was, right? It often included in public festivals, weddings, or holidays. They sometimes were led up to with parades, with huge parades. One of my favorite sort of references I've come across is that in one, I think it was in 1565, the Butchers Guild was so into this fectual that they had their fencers sort of marching out to the plots, the square that they were having this fight in, with a massive sausage that they had to carry on like 6 of their shoulders, right? So like the Cheesemakers Guild made a massive wheel of cheese, and it's all this stuff, right, where it's like the guilds are kind of showing off what they can do, and the men are showing off what they can do by fencing, and it's this whole huge public thing. But it's also subject to these same sort of social strictures, right? You have to obey the law. These have to be lawful. They can't turn violent, right? Which is sort of weird to think about, right? Because effectual is inherently violent. It's 2 men doing violence to one another while everybody else watches, right? But you had to do things like restrict participation. So sometimes we know of effectual that were thrown by people in the who called themselves Freifechter, for instance, who would say right on like the bill when they were getting ready for this thing, saying like, Marksbrüder are not allowed. You can't show up. Or students were banned quite often, right? And you had to make sure that you follow the rules, and you had to make sure that ultimately it's the fencing master who has to kind of bear the burden of all of these people and what they do, right? So it's like, if we went to Long Point turned out to be a massive brawl that spilled out into the streets, of the city. The guy who's going to get talked to about that by the police is Jake Norwood, right? And so like, he's got to make sure that everything is sort of like on the level otherwise, right? Like we said, they can also be small and private affairs. But so when it comes down to it, right, at effectual, this is a massive public festival, and the whole idea is to demonstrate the potential and the high art of fencing. And to real quickly kind of go through the bare bones of this, I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with this already, but essentially what would happen is you get a fencing master, he says, let's have effectual. Pairs would come out at a time, and they would fence with chosen weapons. There's most often the dusack or the longsword or the staff. They would often have what we would consider like exhibition matches. So sometimes the fencing master would select what he called a Freifechter, or like the first fencer, who would come out and have like a demonstration bout with somebody. And the whole idea wasn't necessarily that one of them would win, but that they would demonstrate the potential of the art. They kind of like set the pace. They're like the pace car at a NASCAR event or something like that, right? I know of one reference where someone as sort of exalted as an elector prince came to effectual and had a staff bout with a Freifechter that was chosen by the fencing master. This was probably something like ceremonial, like throwing the first pitch at a baseball game, because you probably don't want somebody to like put the end of a staff through the eye of an elector prince at what's supposed to be a fun public festival. And these kind of things happen, basically right before people came out and were literally trying to brain each other with their swords, right? Because the way that you went about it, effectual, is to strike a bleeding wound on as close to the top of the head as possible on your opponent. And that's all you wanted to do. So you wanted to hit them hard enough that they bleed, but not hard enough that you kill them. And that's really important because you can very easily kill somebody with a fetter, right? This is why we practice nowadays in masks, hopefully fairly well reinforced masks, because you can kill somebody with a fetter. You can also kill somebody with a wooden dusack. You can also very easily kill somebody with a staff, and not to mention something like a pike or a halberd or throwing stones at them or whatever, right? If you win, right, we go out and we have our little bout, and you hit the other person as close to the top of the head as possible, you end up winning 2 golden. And 2 golden is, it'd be the equivalent of maybe a couple $100, maybe. It's a pretty fair percentage of somebody's week's pay, basically, for an average journeyman. So it's not, you're not going to change your life by winning a couple of bouts at effectual, but you can buy drinks, you know, for a comfortable while after that. But really, you go there to show off, right? And there were generally 1 or 2, sometimes more than that, but generally 1 or 2 fencers who would be sort of selected among the crowd of fencers, not by the audience, as particularly, you know, well done fencer, and they would actually earn a laurel wreath. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they won the most matches, although that could be one reason that you've earned a laurel wreath, but it usually meant that they're just a particularly artful or a particularly honorable fencer, right? And so when we talk about little 7-year-old Georg, whose father threw him effectual, the fencing master, you know, awarded him a laurel, whether or not he actually deserved it or it was just the fencing master, like, you know, kind of winking at the dad. I don't really know, but it happened, and the dad wrote about it. He was, you know, proud of it, so he wrote about it to like a cousin of his or something like that. So those are mostly the bare bones, right? Everybody fences until more or less everybody's knocked out. We don't know a lot more than that. We know that the rules were that you could not thrust. There was no running in or einlaufen or wrestling. And we know that you couldn't strike with, you couldn't use the pommel strikes or anything like that. And otherwise, like, those were basically the 3 rules that are mostly common across like every fectual, but there are probably, you know, hundreds of little cultural tweaks in every different place, right? And this wasn't something that was like run by like the Fectual Council, right? These were like a dozen dudes could get bored one Saturday afternoon and throw a Fectual on their own, and they could follow whatever rules they wanted, right? Because these are constructed by the people that are participating, not necessarily by the authorities involved, right? Which is almost the opposite of the way that we kind of structure our sporting events today. These are kind of they're much more comfortable with ambiguity, let's say. But that's more or less what it was, right? You would show up to this thing, you'd probably pay an entrance fee, or the guild might cover that for you. Sometimes that happened, sometimes it didn't. And if you got brained on the head in the first exchange of your first bout, well, that was your day. You're done. Sorry, go home, right? You could also stay up there and fight 15 people at a time and win every time. People might start booing you to give other people a chance, but we don't know, right? And these are part of the kind of unwritten sort of honor code that people just didn't really describe in the way that would satisfy us. And that's at least my conjecture, that it probably would have been pretty frowned upon if it was known that somebody came to effectual just to win money, because that's not the point, right? The point is to demonstrate your sort of martial efficacy to your peers, right? And this was something that was structured specifically for burghers, right? You might be a really rich burgher. You might be like a patrician. You might be somebody who has a horse and you have armor, and your militia group is actually the guys that get to like go outside the city and ride around after guys like Gottsbund Berlichingen. Or you could be a dude who makes shoes, or you could be a dude who repairs shoes, who's even lower on the totem pole, and you can afford a practice sword and a nice set of clothes, and that's about it, right? But while the audience sometimes was noble, participants generally weren't. This is sort of a parallel to like the nightly tournaments, especially the ones toward the turn of the 16th century. They parallel them, but they're not the same, and they don't serve the same purpose for the same group of people at all. They're still very martial. They're still very oriented toward, again, showing off that martial efficacy that everybody wants. But right, this is for the burghers, and this is something that's suited for the burghers. It's built for them. It's built by them. It's supposed to demonstrate their particular contribution to the social structure of the Holy Roman Empire and the military potential of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And it was separate from like a knightly tournament, which is a slightly different thing. And we've already talked about, right, the Fechtmeister would petition the city for permission. And this could be anybody, right? You could have like no credentials whatsoever. You could just be somebody who's very experienced or sort of well known around town as a good fencer. And as long as you sort of checked the boxes that the city council needed you to, you could throw effectual. You could be the guy standing up there with the big staff, making sure that nobody strikes blows they're not supposed to, right? And we often see too that the Marksbrüder and the Freifechter sort of hosted their own competitions independently and often would not let the other people show up, right? So like Marksbrüder, like you gotta be a member of the Hemo Alliance to show up. I'm sorry. And then you could have another guy saying like, you know, we don't want any of you here. We don't want Marksbrüder here because you're just going to cause trouble, right? And students is a really interesting one because from reading a lot of things about the 16th century, the idea of what a student is and what they're capable of in terms of violence has flip-flopped quite a lot because students and clerks were sort of famously violent and famously difficult to control. A lot of woodcuts, which I kind of wish I threw in here every time I talk about them, I wish I throw it in, but there's a woodcut of the city guard in some German town specifically fighting students. Like that's in the name of the woodcut, where they say like, you know, this crowd of students is causing trouble and they had to call like the whole militia out to stop it. Students technically weren't actually allowed to be armed. They existed in a different legal structure that was independent of the city legal structure. So like if you're a burgher on patrol and you see students breaking the law, you have no legal authority to stop them. You basically have to like go get the campus police to come in and deal with that because it's a different legal structure, and that was really important. So they were often banned for pretty good reason, right? They also had rules about what the audience could do and what they couldn't do. So you couldn't do something like the term that was used in the time was throwing shames, right? You couldn't insult the fencers. You couldn't throw dirt clods or rocks at the fencers. There was a ban in one rule set that I read that basically said no untempered frolicking. What the difference between untempered and tempered frolicking is, I don't really know, but you know, this was deliberately structured to be a very serious affair until you get to the Schutzhalter, which is this guy, right? The Schutzhalter is kind of like a fool or like a sort of a comic. He's a comic figure, but he's also the rule enforcer. And something that was actually done pretty often was that the Schutzhalter would have a big paddle. And if somebody broke the rules, whether they were a fencer or an audience member, they would actually like be paddled on the bum in front of everybody, like a number of strikes. And then they'd probably have to pay a fine on top of that too. So the idea was that this was supposed to be a serious thing. There are rules that you have to follow at risk of being punished, even if you're a member of the audience, right? Which is sort of an interesting contrast to the way, if we read like Lecouchner, the way Lecouchner talks about Fechtbucher, almost seems like, you know, strike this guy in the belly for a big laugh, or get your friends to come out of the crowd with a bag, and they'll throw this guy in the bag, and you can do this in a Fechtbucher, and it's funny, right? It seems to be a very different thing by the mid-16th century. All of which is to say, right, that they took this very seriously, and this was a very serious way to let people demonstrate their sort of martial value to the city in a way that was carefully constructed, but also very dangerous, right? And we do have records of people being killed at these. So there's one example of a Fechtbucher that was thrown in, I think it was Augsburg, and they don't even have his name. He just said a journeyman printer had come to the Fechtbucher and he was killed He was struck on the head with a fetter, and he bled to death. And so they arrested the guy who hit him, and they interrogated him, right? They tortured him. They asked, like, did you know this guy? What beef did you have with him? Why did you try to kill him? What were you doing up there fighting somebody you had beef with? And he was like, well, I didn't know him. I didn't have any beef. I didn't intend to kill him. I obeyed all of the rules of the Fechtbucher. And the Fechtmeister and several of the people who threw the Fechtbucher actually sent a letter to the authorities saying that, like, yeah, we know this guy. We know, like, he's a good and honorable, upstanding guy. He followed all of the rules of the Fechtbucher, and they even write to the city authorities, he didn't use his point, he didn't use his pommel, and he didn't wrestle, which I thought was really interesting that they pointed out, like, those kind of three sort of, marquee rules of the Fechtbucher. And said, they literally said this in the letter that they wrote to the authorities. This was in like 1591, that the journeyman printer probably wouldn't have died, but he was a very heavy bleeder, right? And so, like, it's really his fault. It wasn't our guy. Our guy, he did everything right. It was this guy who just bled to death. He shouldn't have showed up. In kind of a sort of a cold-blooded way, but really you can kind of see the logic of trying to disavow that, right? Is because, like, Augsburg had just made Fechtbucher competitions legal again in 1591 after having banned them for like 2 years. And so they're like, yeah, go ahead. This is the first one, right? And this out-of-town printer that nobody even knows his name shows up and dies. And it's like, that threatens the future of the Fechtbucher, and everybody's really nervous about that. So they have to make sure that they say this guy definitely obeyed the rules. He was fencing the way that we taught him how to fence, and the way we taught him how to fence is safe and effective. And this guy just was a heavy bleeder. Sorry. Right? Any questions so far? We're getting pretty close to the end here. So
Yep, we had a few.
Cool.
So we have, was medical attention on standby like at sporting events today?
Probably, yeah. So they would have had barber surgeons, was a really common thing. So barber surgeons actually were a guild. There was a barber's guild. And they would have, especially at like a big public competition, would have definitely like had a tent where they were, charging people for being stitched up after they got hit with a fetter. But yeah, the Barbers Guild was actually like really aggressive at protecting sort of like their expression of medicine, right? They were like very protectionist about it. It's like certain people couldn't do the things that they did. So like they like policed the boundary between like what a barber surgeon did versus what an apothecary did. And one of the only people they let perform the same services of a barber surgeon were actually town executioners, which is sort of a weird, interesting kind of curveball in there. But yeah, they definitely would have been around for sure.
And then we have from Brent, he says, this might be an oddly specific question, but since you could only score an effectual by landing a bleeding head wound, were there any attempts to make these matches more fair for shorter fencers? Seems like it would be harder for them, and I know you were talking earlier about how these more structured acts of violence had ideas of fairness behind them.
That's a really good question, and I don't know. I know that, so it was almost like a king of the hill kind of a thing, from what I said. Like, if you win the match, you get to stay in, and you get another chance to earn some money. But I've read of a lot of matches and descriptions of an entire Fechtbucher where like every pair of fencers is different, right? So it's not like one guy stays in and fights half a dozen dudes. It's like these two guys fence and then they leave, whoever won, and then another two guys come in and fence, and then another two guys come in and fence, and then maybe like one of the first pair comes back and then fences another match or two. So whether they were controlling with height, I don't know. I think it was probably done to a certain extent, but I can't speak to the extent at all. And as far as I know, they didn't write it down. So.
I've got a question.
Sure.
So from reading from Zamora, basically that there were mentions of late 15th century knightly tournaments, or like I use air quotes, knightly tournaments being put on by townspersons, basically the richer patrons. And, we know that the Fechtbucher are very different from those, but my question then is, to what extent should we think of Fechtbucher as something that has evolved from knightly tournaments, or something that has kind of sprung up separately in imitation of it, or as something that is completely different, that is serving its own purpose?
So I think I was probably a little unclear before and rambling a bit, but I think that the Fechtbucher is a deliberate parallel to the knightly tournament. It performs a lot of the same functions, but for a different class, right? So like the knightly tournament it's you get in your best duds, right? And sometimes like you have a suit of armor that you have made for this particular tournament alone, right? It's as much an opportunity to spend money as anything else. And in the Fechtbucher, you might not have a guy wearing a really nice suit of armor, but he's probably wearing his best suit of clothes. They might be wearing a suit of clothes that they had made particularly for that purpose, right? We've seen some of the surviving Paurnfeindt, right? The parade swords, like in the Met collection, that are dazzlingly decorated. And some of the same ones that are the most heavily decorated also appear to have some damage, as if they had been used, right? They also both are deliberately structured to show off skill with weapons that those men would have used in a hypothetical battlefield, right? The knightly tournament is about knocking another dude off a horse with a lance. And the Fechtbucher is about fighting with swords, or fighting with a staff, or fighting with a dusack, all of which could be used in a relatively peacetime civic context of a duel, fighting a fire, doing whatever, could also be used on the battlefield, right? And even like in this image here, they've got two guys with pikes. You're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of fencing with those because of the inherent danger of striking somebody else, even a friend, with a 16-foot long piece of wood. But that is definitely the battlefield weapon of the type of person that would go to a Fechtbucher, right? There's a really great article. I really wish I could remember the name. I think it's just called like The Medieval Tournament, but it's by Stephen Hardy, and it's about how tournaments were structured to echo like the values and the virtues of the knightly class. And I think that the Fechtbucher was something that was deliberately structured to show off the virtues of the burgher class, like unambiguously. That is 100% what was going on. So yeah, I think it is a sort of a deliberate parallel. They know they're not those guys. They know they're not the knights. They know they're not going to get away with pretending to be the knights, but they can do kind of the same thing in their lane, and they're going to do it as best they can, right? And they took it very seriously. And I think that's probably the biggest parallel, right? Is that like a knight riding in a tournament is going to take their thing just as seriously as a burgher going out and swinging a sword at another butcher or whatever at a Fechtbucher.
It looks like Will's got a question.
Sure.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I have a question about the notion of fairness. You mentioned just a little bit ago that you know, the kind of the way that the Fechtbucher would progress would be, you know, pairs of fencers coming out to fence, you know, sort of on their own, I guess. Like which is a lot different from the way that we experience and run tournaments today. And I just was curious about how that how like, you know, contemporary notions of fairness, contemporary to them, would have factored in that. Like I know that dueling, a lot of times there's a lot of social norms that you've spoken about what a fair fight, quote, would look like. Was there specifically, was there, do you know if was there any kind of like private negotiation between the participants that were coming out about, you know, how the fight should progress, or something like that, like what was fair? Thinking about Brent's question of, you know, height, maybe that was, you know, could that have been like a privately negotiated thing for the pairs?
You know, we don't have any description of that, but based on the kind of things I've read, I wouldn't be surprised if you know, like we're all sitting around, all the people in this call, right? We're waiting to go and fence, and maybe I find somebody my height, find somebody I think they move pretty good, seen them warming up, and I say, hey, we should go up and fence, right? I might not know the guy, but I think it'll make a good fight. So maybe we sort of arrange that before we go out, and then as soon as one pair comes off, we just go out. We don't really know. I know that there were some arranged matches, right, with the Freifechter, and if they had like, you know, a Prince Elector comes down and he's going to fence, and so we got to make sure he fences somebody who's not going to accidentally kill him. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if that was just sort of an expectation of the Fechtbucher, is that you're just going to kind of go out and sort of arrange things, right, in a way that they're fair. You might also want to win, and you kind of hope the other guy wants to win too. So you want to make it fair, but you also want to show off, right? And ultimately, that's kind of what it is. So yeah, we don't have any records of that. I don't know that I've come across even anything that might hint at that, but again, certainly nothing that would say that it didn't happen. And obviously also like the sense of fairness, right? I think one of the biggest differences, right, is that you go to a tournament, a HEMA tournament nowadays, and I think the expectation is that you're going to get to fence a bunch, right? And in Madison, Wisconsin, they throw a Fechtbucher every year. They started 3 or 4 years ago. They call it the Madtown Fechtbucher. And the whole thing is deliberately structured to be as close to this as possible. Obviously, we wear gear and everything, but the first year, it was basically that. Like, you come on, you show up, you might fight one match, and you're done. And there were some people who drove in from like Minnesota who got like really annoyed that they made this really long trip to come and fence, and they got to fence one match, and then they lost and they were out, right? So yeah, we have to kind of think about like what would they think is fair, right? And if I'm going to go out and I'm 6'2" and I'm fencing somebody who is like a lot smaller than me, is that even a fight I can be proud of if I win, right? Even if the other guy's really skilled, if I win, it's because I'm tall, right? And if he wins, well, he beat a tall guy, so his victory is always going to be more than mine, right? So it's like, is that kind of bouncing around people's head? We don't really know. And ultimately, unless like somebody wrote a diary about it or something like that where they talk about this, I don't know that we ever can. It's a really good question, and I wish we had more information about it.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
I had a quick question about the state of what almost appears to be undress in this image.
Sure.
Was this like to harken back to Olympic type behaviors?
There, if on Horror, a friend of mine named Chris Van Slambrook wrote an article that is literally about that. It's about how Fechtbucher and how sort of the idea of virtue and even the symbols of virtue and victory that were given to people at Fechtbucher were deliberately structured to be sort of classical. I don't know if these guys are shirtless or if they're just wearing very, very tight doublets, but they might be shirtless. And I know that sort of comic nudity was a big thing at the time in all sorts of public events, so they very well might be. But I do know 100%, at least I've been convinced by Chris, that there are very deliberate echoes of sort of the ancient world that are baked into the Fechtbucher. Absolutely. And then also, the codpiece is a pretty, you're definitely wearing clothes, but you're definitely trying to say that you're not with a codpiece. And they only got bigger over the 16th century to a ludicrous extent. So I've always enjoyed that aspect of it too. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay, so this is basically the sort of wrap up part here. And I'll talk about this guy in a minute too, because I love this image. I love this woodcut. This might be like my favorite woodcut of all time. But anyway, what we're looking at in the 16th century in free cities, at the very least, in the Holy Roman Empire, is that there's a complicated spectrum of violence in which sort of participants all know the rules, right? They have an understanding that they're being watched and they're watching everybody else, right? It's kind of this like social surveillance that's going on between everybody. But if you're a citizen, if you're somebody who has the privilege and the duty to bear arms for your city, you have to be constantly aware of your behavior. You have to be constantly aware that you have to respond to threats against your person or your honor or your property or your guild or your city with violence. You have to, right? And all of the ways that you can respond to this follow fairly predictable and very recognizable patterns, right? And it's even the same way that any of us could go to a bar or a sporting event or anything, and we can watch two people who are about to have a fight, and all of us, without anyone throwing any punch, can recognize that. We can all do it, right? Because it follows a very particular pattern. We don't think of it necessarily that way, but it is extremely predictable, and it's something that we all notice, right? And if you just add that, if you add two frat guys pushing at each other's chests, you give them both swords, we also probably know where that's going to escalate to, right? So like I said, right, men are expected to respond to all of this stuff with a culturally or socially kind of controlled, fair response. So if somebody comes up and calls me a name, I can get away with just calling them a name back. I don't immediately have to go to my sword. But if somebody pulls a sword on me and I opt not to, or I opt to run away, then that was obviously not the response that I was supposed to give, right? And this is also socially kind of policed by my peers. But this violence also served a purpose, right? It makes sure that not every fight ends up being a brawl. It makes sure that sometimes me personally, I have to own up to the things that I said or the things that I did. Or I, in my sort of cultural watchdog position, also have to make sure that other people are performing that purpose as well, right? I can't let my friend run off without properly responding to a threat. So I'm a participant in this culture, and I'm also a witness and an enforcer of this culture as well, right? Whatever part you're playing in the two guys duel at a bar, you are a participant in it in some particular way, right? And Fechtbucher parallel this stuff. They do it very deliberately, and it serves as a sort of a more civic-minded way to use violence in a way that was supposed to be constructive, rather than a way that was to police somebody else's behavior or to respond to a threat to you personally or to behave in a really petty way, right? Fechtbucher is about taking all of this stuff and turning it into a virtue rather than turning it into something that is a sort of a social threat, right? And dueling does the same thing to a different extent. But the Fechtbucher it's meant to be peaceful. It's meant to be not life-threatening, right? But we do see that you do risk dying at a Fechtbucher anyway. It follows particular setup rules, and it serves a particular purpose that everybody involved knows about, right? And that is essentially very similar to a duel, right? It's got the audience, it's got the potential life threat, it's got the fact that you are being watched by people who are judging you for your behavior and your honor. You're doing it to, to kind of put up the virtue of yourself and whatever groups you're a part of at the same time on public display, right? And this is very different than the way we kind of think about sort of the social violence in the earlier century, where all of these Fechtbucher were written by presumably members of the Society of Liechtenauer, is that was meant to be sort of a private thing, right? It's carefully guarded and it's secret. Whereas in the 16th century, this is something that you're doing publicly, and it's very important that it's public. It's very important that you know the secrets of swordsmanship, and you can demonstrate that either in a violent way in a duel or in a Fechtbucher and when it's ostensibly peaceful, right? And so ultimately, I think if there's anything you take away from this, it's that the Fechtbucher is a deliberate addition to this spectrum of violence that is in every way as earnest as a duel, right? It's basically built to be that way, because the duel's not necessarily deadly either. It's not meant to be, right? And we tend to think about duels as being this like no holds barred, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves, maybe possibly, unless he's also been named too, right? And the Fechtbucher is just a way to sort of structure this to give people more opportunities to be violent with their friends rather than fewer, right? If that makes any sense. And we can kind of look at the development of the kind of the interpersonal spontaneous duel, and the Fechtbucher is again one of these sort of graphs that just perfectly parallels one another as they sort of rise in popularity. And ultimately, I kind of want us to think about it as fencers, right? When we go to a tournament and we fence, what are we doing? Are we just out there to win? You know, because we've all fenced somebody who really just desperately wants to win. And I think most of us probably find that maybe a little bit off-putting, maybe. Then again, you know, who knows? Maybe I'm just, I don't know, right? But I think we've all had like a really good bout with somebody that we remember, regardless of who won, right? We've probably had bouts against people that we're not even counting, but we remember them years later because it was just really fun, right? And that, I think, is kind of the idea in the Fechtbucher that I find fascinating. And I think that that's what they were trying to structure as well in the 16th century, is that this is something that it's giving you the opportunity to go out and put your absolute best performance that you can possibly do right out there in front of everybody, and then do it again the next time, and to do it again the next time, right? And I think if we kind of think about fencing in the way that like it's part of this massive spectrum where sometimes I might have to use the deadly tricks because I might die, and other times I might actually like really want to stick to the rules because it makes me a more artful or a more skillful or a craftier fencer. Like that's the idea that really gets me, right? Is that if we reduce fencing only to its deadliest possible aspect, we're only seeing a very small part of it. And the Fechtbucher, I think, helps to kind of explode that idea. As fencing, it's a tool. It's a tool with a multiplicity of purposes. And all of it revolves around like you and your sword and the other guy. And that's it, right? And I find that really fascinating. And I find it more motivating to me than just like going and winning a medal at a tournament, personally. And yeah, like that whole riff, right, is it's difficult to separate earnest, quote unquote, violence from sport violence within this kind of honor culture, right? Because you're being watched and judged for your honesty and virtue, even if you're just sharing a drink at the pub, right? So how can we think of the Fechtbucher as something that's somehow less than that, or it's just a sport, right? Or it's not as serious as like the Leichenauer stuff was, right? And I think as you know, CKDF primarily following like the earlier Leichenauer tradition rather than Meyer, I think it's really kind of important to take this stuff away and just think about it, right? Like what function does it serve? And is that a function that you sort of want to propagate as we fence as modern people, right? So any last questions? Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, Adam. I'll stick around and we can chat. But thank you very much, Adam, for your time, and hope to chat with you again soon.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for having me. It was great.
Oh, next week we're having Jess Finley. She's going to be talking about the pursuit of knighthood, fencing, hunting, dance, and romance. Basically discussing hunting and its use as an allegory for fencing, romance, and dance, and her research on that topic. So next week, same time.
Sounds awesome.
Who's your guy, Adam? The engraving.
Yeah, why do you like him so much?
So, so this is from an artist named Franz Baum. And you actually see like the earlier thing of a soldier that I had earlier was also from the same guy. But I just look at this guy. Like count the beards in this picture for one thing, right? Like he's got this huge beard. He's wearing like a male cowl. I think they called that a bishop's mantle.
Mm-hmm.
And they were actually fairly common. And my conjecture about this is that it was probably a way to kind of skirt around the rules that you might, you as a militiaman need to have like a breastplate. Maybe this kind of counted somehow as a breastplate rather than actually having to go spend the money on a breastplate. You've got this cool bishop's mantle that you're wearing. But like he's got this huge comb like on his hat. And his hat is just like a Phrygian cap. It's like tied onto the outside of his cap. He's got this like huge, it looks like he's got a big earring in his ear. His sword has a beard. Like I just love it. I love this picture so much. I want to know who this guy is.
This reminds me of medieval manuscript depictions of wild men.
Yeah, yeah,
Like kind
exactly.
of or at least the way that the male and the rings are depicted. It almost looks like he's got hair on his arms.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But despite that, right? Despite being, pretty stocky guy too. Like he's got that foot turn. He's got that turned out front foot.
Yeah.
Right. He's got the hips in what is Rob Rutherford has a specific term for that when like your forward foot and your hip are discordant, he calls it. He's got the discordant hips. He's clearly like talking to somebody else, giving him the business. Like, hey man, listen.
Yeah.
I just really like it. It's fun.
This is like your quintessential like master, I guess. Like
Yeah.
this just makes me think of all of those like rickety like ballet dancers that have been in the game for so long that they're just like these waves of people with these I love it.
Yeah. He's like he reminds me of like Anthony Hopkins at like the beginning of the Zorro movie he was in.
Yes.
Right? When he's like this freaky old guy who like kicks the shit out of this dude with like a cane. Like that's what he is. He's been in prison for 20 years. And he comes out, throws on his old armor, off to get revenge.
Could he be a Landsknecht? I've been reading Swords and Swordsmen by Mike Lodes. Talks about that.
Yep. So
that era.
I believe I think the title of this is just like soldier with beard and sword, I think is the title of his woodcut. And I'm almost it was soldat. It's not what do you call it? Landsknecht. And whether that makes a difference, I'm not really sure. Because I'm not actually, I should look up like what the sort of demarcation was between soldier and Landsknecht. But I know like it's 1559, Landsknecht still exist. They're still around.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Has a similarly absurd style of dress and sword style.
Yeah, definitely. Alrighty. Well, I think I'm going to take off. Thanks again, Charles.
All right. Thank you, Adam.
Super fun. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah.